Hi, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar where we're going to be exploring AGV and AMR trends that are shaping the industry. My name is Ellie Allen Bathe, and I'm a content marketing manager here at Flexware. Before we get started today, just a couple quick housekeeping notes. First, if you have any questions throughout today's presentation, feel free to drop those in the questions tab of the toolbar, and we'll answer those throughout today's interview. Also, today's session is being recorded, and we'll make that recording available to you shortly after we wrap up today. Now that that's out of the way, I'd like to introduce the two speakers that are here with me today. I'm joined today by Tom Andersson and Bryce Bucher. Bryce is the Vice President of Products here at Flexware, and he has over 30 years of experience developing and implementing product strategy. He also oversees Flexware's intralogistics platform Lift, and today he will be interviewing Tom based on the AGV and AMR Robotics 2025 report. And then we have Tom, and Tom is the principal analyst and founder of STIQ Ltd. And for the past 6 years, he has produced a report on AGV and AMR robotics, and that's based on interviews with key stakeholders and takeaways from major trade shows. Bryce, you can go ahead and jump right into the interview.
All right, thanks a lot, Ellie. Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, wherever you're at. Thank you for joining. And Tom, I'd like to start just with a quick introduction of yourself. And for those in the audience who may not be aware about STIQ, maybe some brief history around STIQ, the organization, and some of the reports that you produce, and then we'll get into the interview after that.
So thanks for that, Bryce. Yeah, so my name is Tom Andersson, and I'm the founder of STIQ Ltd. We are quite a unique market research publisher because all our reports are essentially free to download and share. So what you're seeing on the screen right now is essentially a free download. The way that came about is I have a background in mergers and acquisitions research. So I used to help venture capital and private equity houses. I pivoted that format into a free format in 2018 and have since had about 70,000 downloads of our reports. We estimate that each report leads to about 5 shares, a viral multiple that we have as well. So it's quite a big audience that we have. We interview companies across the globe, stakeholders, including vendors, end customers, investors, and component suppliers, software vendors like yourself, and so on as well. Yeah, so that's a very brief introduction.
All right, excellent. And as you mentioned, we're going to talk today mostly about the AGV and AMR Robotics report, which was released in December of 2025. So lots of data that is included in that report. I'm going to go through maybe some of the highlights from that report, but also take some questions from the audience as they come up as well. So we'll hit on all things related to AGV and AMR. But let's start a little bit with some trends. Can you, going back to 6 years ago when you started this report till now, what are some of the larger historical trends that you've noticed in this industry over that span of time?
So there's quite a few different trends, but the dominant one, I must say, is probably the increasing fragmentation of vendors. So we right now we probably track about 600 vendors globally, and that continues to grow. And when we started writing these reports, we always thought, well, there must be some kind of consolidation in this sector because it's so fragmented. But we see no end to that fragmentation, to be honest, and it's a very interesting aspect, but it's also driven by software vendors. We'll get to that later, I'm sure. Standards. So we're seeing that standards are finally catching up with the sector as well as it has exploded, and that's quite an interesting aspect as well, how people are kind of managing safety standards and so on as well, and fleet management standards and so on as well. There's also a big technology push, which is quite an agnostic trend, from perhaps line-guided vehicles towards more SLAM-based or visual SLAM-based technologies as well. Even getting into that technology kind of swamp, there's loads of various different technologies. People normally say AGV and AMR when they mean either or. So technology fragmentation is also there. There's new fleet management software that has kind of evolved in the last perhaps 5 years or so, 5 to 10 years, which is then agnostic fleet managers or fleet management software where you can manage several different vendors. That has also become a bit of a trend and is increasingly required by the market as well. There are also some early signs of what we want to call intralogistics operating system, but we'll touch on that a bit later as well, I think. Finally, if we go back to the fragmentation, so I should say also, so for example, in North America, we've obviously seen that Rockwell acquired Otto, and Zebra acquired Fetch Robotics as well. So there is consolidation, but it tends to be among perhaps more well-funded or leading companies rather than many different ones.
Excellent. Ellie, do you have a question from the audience?
Yes.
Maybe not? Okay.
Yes, I do. Sorry. Grabbing a question from the audience here. One says 600 vendors. How many of these vendors have been around for 5 or more years? And how many of them are a viable option for manufacturing and warehousing operations?
Good question. I don't have the exact number of how many of them have been available or have been around for more than 5 years, but the thing is, it's very, very easy to create a robot and to have that perhaps like a manufacturer could potentially even do it on their own. So if that's a good answer, I'm not sure, but I can look into it and let you know the actual statistics. But how many of those are feasible for someone to use? It depends on the size of the deployment as well. If you only want to have 2 robots to do something, then any vendor it's feasible. I think if you want to have many hundreds of robots, then perhaps you need to work with someone who has done hundreds before and have good knowledge and expertise about what it actually takes to deploy such a big deployment. Yeah, and that's obviously a grayscale far in between that as well. So yes, even if they're 5 years old, they can probably do a smaller. Yeah.
And then a follow-up on that as well is, do you think AMRs will take over as the primary mobile automation platform for intralogistics?
It's a definition issue. So typically when people say AMRs, they mean mobile robots that has some kind of object avoidance system in it. Now, there are use cases where that is a good thing. There are use cases where that's a bad thing. So for example, if you're an automotive manufacturer and you have to have, or you calculate the time from point A to point B to be 50 seconds, and you need something to come in 50 seconds, do you want that mobile robot to be able to avoid something on that road and perhaps extend that delivery time to 1 minute, 10 seconds? Probably not. So instead, you need to have a very, very clear path for that robot. So that's an automotive manufacturer. If you're looking at more kind of dynamic environments, perhaps like a warehouse, then perhaps that's easier to deploy what we call AMRs. Because of the environment is changing, there are no set kind of times for anything and so on as well. Yes, so I hope that explains the answer.
Let me just add a little bit to that too, Tom. One thing that we're seeing is this convergence between the 2 different types of technologies, and I'm almost thinking at some point in time they're going to converge to the point where there's not going to be 2 different types of technology. You're getting natural feature recognition and other more advanced navigation technology implemented in AGV style vehicles. You're getting AMRs that are doing more traditional line following capabilities as well. So they're each borrowing from the best of the other space, and we're getting this sort of convergence as we move forward, especially on the software side as well.
Interesting.
Hey,
so on a point to that, actually, we've seen or we've heard of where robots actually using both systems. So they have the line guided as a base, and then they actually have SLAM as kind of secondary system as well.
Yep, for sure. Let's go back to the fragmentation topic a little bit and the 600 different vendors globally. Um, can you talk a little bit about the complexity of the projects that the vendors that you're interviewing are working on, and help understand and break down maybe that diversity of projects that may be feeding into why there's 600 different vendors out there? Um, can you lay that out for us a little bit?
So yeah, sure. I mean, we see so when we look at this sector, there are 600 vendors. That doesn't mean that if you have a project in North America that you would get all those 600 vendors in your RFQ at any one point if you just search for them or contact them. There are a lot of vendors that only work locally, like in their country. So perhaps even in Mexico or in, let's say in China even, or India and so on as well. They only operate within their countries. So let's say, so we call those tier 3 players. Typically they work on smaller projects, perhaps up to 5-10 robots or something, where it's fairly simple layouts. The flows are quite known. And then we go up to tier 2, which is probably companies that work across several countries. They have far bigger scope, probably up to 100 robots or something like that, depending on the type of robots. So perhaps more of the mouse vehicle rather than forklifts, which are far more complex. But then you have tier 1 vendors as well, who there's far smaller kind of selection among those. If you are let's say for argument's sake, Procter & Gamble, and you need to have a project done in perhaps 2-3 countries that look similar, perhaps you need 100 forklifts with some mouse vehicles as well, then you go to the tier 1 vendors who only work with this.
Yeah, and I thought a fascinating stat from your report was that when you look at those tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3 type of vendors, 2% of the vendors fell in that tier 1 space, 8% into the tier 2 space, but the remaining 90% are in that tier 3 space. And if I remember correctly, this is mostly brownfield projects, small POCs like you were mentioning. So it's fascinating that the majority of these vendors are working in these small POCs, which it probably makes scalability very, very difficult, and probably a contributor to why we're getting so much fragmentation and some retraction in the market. Would you agree with that statement?
Yep. I mean, tier 1 vendors are very few and far between, but probably account for the majority of value in the market. So like the inverse pyramid as well. And tier 2, they are, so perhaps going back one step, it's very, very difficult to move from a tier 3 vendor into a tier 2 vendor as well. And from a tier 2 to a tier 1 is equally difficult. Typically, customers look at, so if you're a customer looking at, let's say, 50 robots, then you probably are looking at vendors that have done 50 or more robots at some point. You won't be looking at vendors that have deployments perhaps with less than 10 robots, unless you have a very, very, very good feeling about the vendor. So it's a very, very specific kind of sector. And I think one more thing that I just want to make clear as well for the audience who are looking, when we're talking about AGV and AMR robotics, we're talking about robots that are used for transportation only. So these are not used for storage. So like Andersson robotics have millions of robots that are deployed, but those are mainly used for storage deployments. And this is not what we're talking about right now.
Okay. Talking about just the movement of items from point A to point B within the 4 walls of a facility.
Yes, there is a grayscale, and it overlaps as well, because some forklifts are used for storage and so on as well. And there is, but that's the primary what we're talking about right now. Yes.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So let's talk a little bit about retraction. There's been, oh, I'm sorry, Ellie, did you have a question from the audience? Go ahead.
One question there before we do that. So this one is, do you see bigger companies moving, or do you see companies moving into bigger deployments for pallets or roll cages?
into bigger deployments?
Yes, like more AMRs being used, like more than 100.
The short answer is yes. We've seen there's quite a lot of innovation, or if it's innovation or if it's market push or pull. There's quite a lot of robots going into roll cages as well being used. We've seen quite a lot of that happening in Europe, for example. Pallet handling, obviously there's autonomous forklifts that manages pallets, but there's also mouse robots where that takes kind of pallets of goods here and there within factories and warehouses as well.
Great, thank you.
Let's dig a little bit into the topic of fragmentation, but also retraction. You mentioned earlier about Otto's acquisition by Rockwell and also Fetch's acquisition by Zebra. One of those has worked out better than the other, as we both know. So, and there's been less than stellar performance reported by some of these vendors over the last few years, and especially in the AMR space, it feels like there's some struggles. So can you speak to what do you think is contributing to the poor performance, the retraction, and do you foresee more of this coming throughout this year and beyond?
Okay, so I don't want to be a doomsayer here. The sector is healthy and companies are doing quite well, but the fact remains that it's very, very difficult to just spin up a serious AGV and AMR company and make money from that. There is a lot of price pressure. There is a lot of complexity. There are plenty of end customers who perhaps do not fully understand the complexities involved with adding a mobile robot or AGVs and AMRs into their flows as well. It takes quite an advanced customer to understand how their flows are working and to start off with an AGV and an AMR as well. And as a vendor, if you get, sometimes you want to have a really big project as well, but bigger projects also mean bigger risk. And we've seen a few vendors potentially taking on a bit too much risk and ending up losing money on some of those projects in the end because of the complexities. You have to go back and change things and so on as well. So unless you're really an expert in this space, it is quite difficult to make money.
Yeah, being more on the software side of this space than the hardware side, we always try to start our customer conversations with framing up what we call the problem space. So what is the complexity of the problem and how can we add some value to be able to help step in and solve that problem? And we always use this model. We call it the what, where, and how model. And the what side of that is trying to depict the complexity of the types of items that have to be moved around by these vehicles. And it ranges, as we all know, between different container sizes, shapes, weights, etc. So there's this huge diversity when it comes to the what you're moving around, where you're moving it, the locations, everything from high rack storages to floor locations to robot cells, conveyors, you name it. Where you're putting it is just as diverse as the what that you're moving around. And then finally, the how of that is you just need a lot of different styles of vehicles and robots in order to be able to do that. But it creates a sort of spaghetti, a mess of complex problems that need to be solved. And if you're really looking out into where you're going from a digital transformation standpoint, you're looking to go to unattended lights out operations. In order to do so, you've got to figure out how to do all those different styles of things with a set of automation. And most likely, it's not going to be just one vendor that you're going to go after. You're going to have to do it with multiple vendors. Is that a trend that you are starting to see more of as you're talking to end customers and vendors out there?
Yes, and so we started talking to end customers 6 years or even before then, and we got. So some of them were saying like, yeah, so we had a project here where we wanted to automate different processes, but we found that we had to contact several different vendors to do those things. So they ended up at that time, they ended up with just using one vendor because it became too complex and there were no proper software to manage the two different solutions at that time. So they just went with the one that had the most impact on the operations, for example.
Yeah. Everybody kind of likes that one, one butt to kick mentality where, if they could go through one vendor, it obviously simplifies things, but it also does add some complexity if that vendor isn't able to meet the full breadth of the solution. Hi, Ellie. Do you have another question
Yes,
for the audience?
so this one says system success depends on the technology supplier and user, and the first two factors are within the supplier's control. The third is outside their control. Systems can ultimately fail because of this third factor, the user. Comment on the user risk to a successful system outside of the supplier's control.
Yeah, so we've heard of plenty of projects where customers have appointed, this is just an example, where they've appointed a project manager to manage and evangelize the use of mobile robots within a company. Midway through a project, he leaves for another job without any mitigation or any backups. So these projects tend to not fail, but they end up perhaps far below the throughput that was sold initially. And we've seen loads of or we've had many of those kind of conversations or discussions with end customers. So if you do one of these projects as an end customers, you need to have that evangelist, but you also need to have a backup to make sure that the project goes as expected. Yeah, you need to have clear expectations between the parties of what is contracted and what is expected, and how that is supposed to be tested as well at some point. Yeah, so
I'll just add a little bit to that as well. What we've seen with our customers, and this kind of goes back to something we talked about earlier, where 90% of the vendors are solving these small, 2 to 5 vehicle projects and POCs, because that's typically how an end customer would start, is on a small proof of concept. But you've got to be able to scale that if you're going to really move forward with a solution that's going to solve all your problems and be more of a holistic solution moving forward. So, and that requires a lot of planning, to your point, on the customer side. And I think one of the biggest things we see customers do incorrectly is they start with a very small team on a very small scope in one corner of their facility, a single facility. And that is the right way to start, to kind of prove things out. But you also have to have a bigger vision, and you have to know where you're going, because you have to know how to scale that solution when you get beyond that first project. And vendors have to be able to support the customers on this journey as well. So it really does take that evangelist attitude, like you were saying, and a consultative approach to be able to help customers and guide them along this journey. Okay. One other thing I wanted to hit on when it comes to the market, quite a bit of talk about China, and your report did dedicate quite a few pages to China and the influence that it's having on this particular market. Just wonder if you could take a few minutes to just kind of comment on trends you're seeing when it comes to China's influence on this market globally.
So yeah, the Chinese market is huge for AGVs and AMRs, with the caveat that Amazon is probably producing more of these mobile robots for storage that we were talking about before than the whole of China potentially currently do. China is pushing down prices. There is in China, in the domestic market, there are, first of all, if you're building a new factory, which they do kind of every month, every week, and so on as well, you simply have robots as a part of that factory, and that comes as a greenfield opportunity in those factories. And it's kind of it's taken for granted that you have robots these days in those facilities. So there is a huge market for that. But I say as well, there's huge competition for all those projects. and there tend to be very specialist vendors. You know, someone works only with battery factories, someone works only with automotive factories, and so on as well. But all those vendors are trying to go abroad as well, because in the domestic market it's very, very difficult to gain any margin on projects. Projects are often sold at possibly not a loss, but very, very near. So to gain margins, they're all trying to go abroad. Now, everyone haven't kind of succeeded in going abroad yet, but the more and more of them want to do it as well. So they're kind of like depressing prices, especially in China, but also outside of China, especially in Asia, but also going abroad. They're trying to do that. But if we go again the step and look at this grayscale between storage and transportation. So Amazon, they are hugely influential as well. They've probably deployed over 1 million robots themselves, and they're very influential in kind of control or influencing component suppliers to develop new components, to develop new navigation systems, and so on as well. They have started going into these transportation robot. I think the robot is called Proteus, but that robot is so the component suppliers, they expect them to make as many approaches as they've made of their previous storage robots as well. So they've been very influential in kind of shaping how components are made in the space as well. But yeah, and then the Chinese vendors as well, often using Chinese component suppliers and yeah, driving down prices for everyone. And interestingly enough, we've seen in the last few years as well that more and more innovation is coming from Chinese vendors. We're seeing different form factors, different types of use cases as well coming from China, which is very, very interesting, I think. And I think that will spread into the West as well, into Europe and North American markets.
Yeah, interesting. Well, it's a fascinating topic to keep an eye on for sure as we go through this year. Let's segue into some other key topics that you hit on within the report that may have some items worth discussing here or noting. So you mentioned earlier both standards as well as safety. So just on the general concept of safety, is there any big key takeaways that you found inside of your report or things that we should be looking forward to for this particular year?
Yeah, so when it comes to safety, so the number one is that we see that every customer are taking safety really, really serious. Now, there haven't been any particular, so also I want to caveat everything I say now by saying that I'm not a safety expert. For anyone out there who's looking for safety should really talk to a safety expert. But in general, we can say that, so first of all, customers take safety seriously. Because there haven't been a very specific standard for mobile robot safety, it has gone, I think it has gone under machine safety. People have been looking at that, but customers have also kind of developed their own safety standards. So vendors typically, when they go to a customer, they have to go through many, many different rigorous tests to be ready to, and that's even before they've sold the vehicle to them. Yeah. Interestingly, when you talk about safety as well, if we talked about China recently, when we talk to Chinese vendors, they always, I shouldn't say that they think it's very interesting that in the West you can have a person who steps into the path of a robot to hurt themselves on purpose to get insurance payouts and so on as well. When they think about in China, that would never happen, because if you injure yourself, you can't work anymore, and that's kind of like a no-no. So in the safety concept in China perhaps is that stay out of the way of a robot, because you know, you need to work tomorrow as well. But whereas in the West, everything has to be caged in and so on as well. So that's a lot of vendors who move from China into the West see that as a bit of an interesting way of handling it. So there are also different safety standards. We're seeing a few more being developed right now, but we think that the sector will move on again, and potentially those safety standards will have to be kind of added to by the end customers as well. as we talked. The most well-developed ones perhaps are in Europe, where you have to apply to, or where you have to have a certification of your whole robot as well to actually sell into vendors. That's a bit different in the US, where it's more at the component level, where you have two kind of sensors that have to both agree that there is no one in the way, for example, and so on. Yes.
Interesting. All right. Let's move into the topic of software. As these vendors try to differentiate themselves between one another, what we're seeing is the emergence of software being that thing that differentiates. Can you highlight some of the trends that you're seeing on the software side when it comes to AGVs and AMRs?
So what we were talking about before as well, there are several different layers. So we have navigation software, we have localization software, and then we also have fleet management software. So in navigation software, there's a lot of different developments. There's loads of companies offering navigation software to companies who want to build their own robots. So we probably track about 50 or 60 vendors of navigation software, which is also adding to this further fragmentation in the sector. It's far easier to develop a mobile robot if you have someone to do the navigation for you. There are various different providers with various different technologies. So at the top, perhaps we have technologically at the top, perhaps not market top, is Visual Slam, which then uses camera and LiDARs and so on as well. And then below that, you have 2D, 3D LiDAR. And as you go down, you have fewer and fewer sensors. So that's one of the trends that we're seeing. In fleet management, we've also seen, so we saw the emergence of the agnostic fleet manager, which has now more or less turned into several different components. So we have orchestration, we have agnostic fleet manager, and they manage robots at various different levels. Some only look at orders, what incoming orders, and dispatch those. Some look a bit lower at navigation of each of the vehicles and so on as well. And that's there are certain different vendors of that. But we also see the emergence of a third software, which we call the intralogistics operations software, where some of the companies with the VSLAM components have now started to also offer localization or real-time localization, RTLS, that you can actually put onto your manual vehicles as well, on your forklift, let's say, to ensure that if you have a robot and a manual vehicle that comes into a crossing, you can actually slow down the mobile robot and let the manual forklift pass. But so that this iOS, or which is a bit silly name perhaps, but intralogistics operating system, it makes the flow in factories more harmonic, if we can call it that. But that also means that it's really, really difficult to find a really easy ROI for that type of software. That's a really interesting development that we see.
Yeah, I would imagine that there's also a difficulty there when you try to introduce that sort of advanced technology into operations that probably have legacy deployments that may not be able to support that sort of behavior. And you need all these systems to be working together in order to be able to create that sort of, what you call a symphony or like a arrangement. So I think that's one thing that customers are facing is how do we, it's one thing to introduce all this new stuff into greenfield locations, brownfield locations, mixed fleets, lots of legacy technologies, lots of manual vehicles still. How do we make this stuff work? Because if we're going to get the ROI, like you said, the ROI is very difficult in some of these projects on their own. So you have to combine multiple facets together. How do we do that? And is there technology out there that can help us? And I think the short answer is it's going to take a lot of different offerings in different spaces working together in order to be able to do that. We're also, we're more on the orchestration side of things, but we partner with a lot of fleet management software that's out there. We partner with RTLS software that's out there. So you have these convergence of these different, traditionally separate spaces now together. and you don't have one platform yet that can do it all. So, Ellie, did you have another question from the?
Yep, question here. How much does the facility environment affect the choice of navigation technology? So things like natural feature LiDAR vision, magnet, laser target, etc. Navigation references and these technologies are impacted by the environment and object movement activity. Vehicles can track poorly in certain facility environments. What are those factors that affect navigation?
Question kind of answers itself. Yes, it's very important that so obviously if you're in, let's say, in a very dusty environment, you might not be able to see with a visual SLAM navigation, and then it might be better that you use a magnetic tape or whatever. So the environment is also heavily influencing the choice of navigation that you use. Typically, tier 1 and tier 2 vendors, they have options, I would say, that you can select. So you can either go with a 2D LiDAR, or you can go with magnetic tape, or even with VSLAM, some of them have that as well, to kind of to give you the best option as well. But there's a cost implication with that as well, as always. But yeah, the question answered itself, I think.
Let's dig a little bit deeper into software, especially when it comes to standards. You had mentioned standards were starting to catch up. It's something we've seen kind of evolve, but somewhat slowly over the years. So, um, are we there yet? And if not, when do you think we're going to be there with these standards? They're going to help us um, with some of this interoperability that we're going to have to tackle as we as we do these mixed fleet implementations and implementations with human-oriented movements, etc.
Yep. So a few years ago, 3-4 years ago, VDA, which is the German Automakers Association, obviously launched VDA 5050, and that has gone through various different iterations for operations between, to understand how the various different fleets can operate with each other as well. So that was the meaning of that. 3 or 4 or even 5 years ago, there were not really that many fleets where there were interchanges between different solutions. If there were, they were normally kind of part of a logic solution. But these new interoperability standards obviously coming in and kind of pushed the fleet management, agnostic fleet management sector as well ahead of time. We see when we talk to end customers, we see that there is a demand. One of the issues a few years ago was that no one knew who would pay for it. So you had like these fleet managers, agnostic fleet managers, that wanted to sell in to companies to manage various different fleets, but no one wanted to pay for it, essentially. Nowadays, we have seen that quite a few of the vendors have actually adopted VDA 5050 and can be the master, if you want to call it like that, for the VDA 5050 as well. We also see other, there's also some ISO, I think ISO standard being developed for intraop as well.
Yeah.
I think it's controlled out of the US so far, or with European.
I was going to ask you about that one. That is fairly new. It sounds like maybe you're not super familiar with it yet, or know what kind of foothold it's got. Okay.
So when we talk to people, VDA 5050 is the primary, and we also see Chinese vendors are adopting that. We've also seen that it's coming to the US. It's being adopted there as well. So presumably, I don't know anything about the ISO standard, to be honest. Yeah. I haven't been able to talk to those that team that manages that. But the VDA is kind of, because the automotive sector and the German automotive sector have been very influential in the AGV and AMR sector as a whole. So that's why as well that everybody has, or most people have adopted it anyway.
Yeah. All right. Okay, so let's move into the hot topic, which is AI. Um, Talk to us a little bit about some of the trends and things you're hearing in this market when it comes to AI, and specifically this phrase physical AI that we're starting to hear more about.
Mm, yep. Physical AI, where should I start? I think there's always been some level of AI in the sector. It's been more discrete. So VSLAM, for example, or Visual SLAM, is one example of artificial intelligence being used, but it's discrete. It's typically only used for visual navigation, so it can recognize people, it can recognize items and so on as well when it looks at the scene or the environment. That is something that we're starting to see more and more of. But these artificial intelligence softwares or systems tend to be discretely embedded or part of a small system as a whole. We're not seeing it yet in more, how to say, advanced, in bigger deployments, because in bigger deployments you have this, you want to know what's going to happen. You don't want an AI to be able to give you an answer that perhaps this time you should you shouldn't go directly to the next stage, because you should do something else. You should route around something else as well, and thereby take more time, so the whole factory perhaps have to shut down for a moment. So yeah, the physical AI we see primarily potentially in something like humanoids.
Okay, okay. We'll get there for sure as we keep talking here, but let's dig into the physical AI thing a little bit more here as well. If you look at like the textbook definition of physical AI, we're talking about this intelligence layer that allows robots and machines to interpret their physical environment at least as well as humans do. And so we're talking about now, obviously, the automation of material transportation within a facility, and all those decisions that a human just does so naturally. We're now, we need to be able to automate those things within our machines and our devices. So um, are you seeing any particular companies emerging in this space that you think are ones worth keeping an eye on as we go through this year when it comes to this concept of physical AI?
So there are a few companies that are driving Visual SLAM, and Visual SLAM is this kind of physical AI where you can recognize people, you can differentiate perhaps rather people and items. So what that means is that a robot has the potential of recognizing if there is a threat to a human, or if there is risk we should say instead, to a human, and thereby slow down. If something in the way is an object or not a person essentially, then you can continue at the same speed and perhaps avoid an object at the same time. That's essentially what this is about. That if you recognize a person, take more care, increase the risk profile, what might happen, and so on as well, slow down, etc. And that will be useful, because right now with 2D and perhaps even 3D LiDAR navigation and other forms of navigation, it doesn't discriminate between a person and an item. So even, for example, if you, let's say you have a big cart or a carton just, and you drop down the floor, then it can't see that it's a carton right now, and it thinks that it needs to stop essentially for that carton. But if it was a VSLAM potentially enabled, where it could see or kind of understand that it's a carton, then it can just drive past neatly and kind of perhaps even shimmy the carton a bit on the way. And that's essentially kind of like the next stage of robots. Yeah. I think there are a few companies that do it, but I'm not entirely sure to what extent they have many different deployments and so on. Yes.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Well, we mentioned humanoids earlier. Oh, before I get there, Ellie, sounds like you have another question.
Yep, going back a little bit to the software conversation we were having before physical AI, how do you think supplier-provided fleet managers and agnostic fleet managers cohabitate? Is the end customer being penalized by the supplier who is charging them for the fleet manager if they use a different fleet manager that is agnostic? So essentially, how would the end customer rationalize this for themselves?
Uh, I think that's a discussion that they would probably have with the vendors. So quite a few vendors right now have the potential to manage different fleets as well within their own software, and that's quite a few vendors have worked towards that. If you, for example, have two vendors, AGV vendors, that differently, and then you have two fleet managers for that, you would potentially end up buying a third fleet manager as well. But you might be better off doing that because you have a smoother functionality in your factory. So there are many different variables that needs to be looked at, I think.
Yeah,
Unfortunately, it's not a very simple answer. Yeah.
no, it's not. And this is the world that we live in daily. And you hit it on the head. It's very complex, and it it tends to vary based on the customer and the use case. And back to something you had said earlier, definitions are very important here. So a lot of people refer to fleet management, and they may actually not be talking about traditional fleet management, but something close kin to that, like orchestration. So we try to separate orchestration from fleet management. So it may be um, that you invest in individual fleet managers from the OEMs of your mixed fleets, and they do a very good job of managing their individual fleets in their spaces. And the fact of the matter is, you may not have a lot of shared spaces between those fleets, maybe some handoff areas, maybe some intersections, et cetera. But there are other ways that you might be able to handle those small percentage of intersections and shared spaces without having to go get buy a third party global fleet manager that you can set on top of all your fleet managers that may be handled through some sort of orchestration software or handshaking that you do down at the control layer. There's lots of ways you can approach that. So to your point, every one of these has to be a conversation, and you have to kind of weigh the pros and cons of adding more software to your stack versus leveraging existing pieces of software and integrating them together. It's very, very complex. But I feel like the the terminology is starting to come around where people are starting to be able to talk about this in a little bit more of a way that allows for effective communication, as opposed to several years ago when everyone just looked at anything related to software as fleet management. And obviously, it's much more complex than that. Ellie, do you have another question?
Yep, a follow-up to that, and I think kind of tees up perfectly to what you were just talking about, Bryce. So this question is for you. Can you elaborate on how you separate orchestration from fleet management? Does it have to be separated, or can it be one platform?
Well, I think it can be one platform. I think Tom hit on this. It can be one platform if the vehicles that you need for the use cases that you are trying to solve can be handled by um, a centralized fleet manager that either has common vehicle controls underneath it that it can communicate with, or through standards like VDA 5050 can manage all of those fleets. That might be good enough because you have very defined routes you're taking, very defined use cases, not a lot of decision making that needs to be included. When we start to move into the world of orchestration, is when the level of business logic that you need to implement goes above and beyond what is available to a fleet manager. Now, a fleet manager is most likely not going to have a lot of interfacing into other systems. They may not have a lot of the data they need to make some of the human-centric decisions that need to be made. It's not stuff just as simple as, oh, I need to divert a vehicle around an obstacle or a different path because my preferred path is blocked. It's I need to wait to even make a call for a job because I know that there's going to be a second item coming in the next 5 minutes, and I can actually bundle those together and move them together. that is something a human does have the ability to make based on their knowledge and experience, their interaction with systems and other people. And that's the point we're going with orchestration, is being able to handle a lot of that constant decision making and business logic that's required in order to be able to fully automate all of these very complex processes. So we tend to kind of say orchestration is the strategic coordination between all of these different systems and bringing together the data that you need to be able to make those decisions in real time, as opposed to fleet management and interoperability is more about the effective cooperation of different physical systems together to be able to safely and effectively operate within shared spaces. It's just back to your grayscale comment, Tom. I mean, there's just a very thin, fuzzy line that separates those two, but it can be very important when you're trying to figure out how to scale something across not only a plant, but your entire organization. Okay, I'd like to go back to humanoids because that's another one of these things that gets people's attention, and I think all look at them being an important piece of this puzzle as we move forward. So, and I think you guys do a humanoids report as well. So help us understand what are the key things we need to be thinking about with humanoids? How far away are we? You know, when can we expect them to be more of a normal part of some of these operations we're talking about, et cetera?
So different ideas. But anyway, so if you were to believe the hype or what you're seeing, all the videos and everything, it could be already yesterday that humanoids have taken over the world. But in reality, it's probably that we won't see any widespread adoption of humanoids anytime soon, perhaps in 5 years, perhaps beyond that. We currently track about 200 vendors globally, and we think that there are actually more. It's quite easy to announce that you're making a humanoid, and to make one, you put two cobots together and something that looks like a head, and you're making a humanoid. The serious players are probably far closer to something deployable than many of those, the long tail of those 200 vendors. But it's a really tough robot. And what we have talked about now in the last 50 minutes or so is that it's very, very difficult to deploy even mobile robots that are fairly simple, but it quickly becomes complex. And taking then a humanoid into this mix as well, I'm not sure if that will be any easier to deploy or harder. The promise is that it will be easier, but let's see where we get to. We continue seeing these robots on trade shows across the globe, in China, in the US, and Europe, and so on as well. But none of them are making anything really seriously exciting. They are moving a few boxes. Perhaps they are serving you with a can of fizzy drink or something at the show. But there's nothing really tangible just yet, anyway. So yeah, I think it will take a bit of time.
Stay tuned then. Okay.
But
all right,
if I may add something there, is that what we are seeing is that it has crept up to board level, and many of the companies that we are talking to, like vendors of non-humanoid robots, are being asked increasingly to ensure that their systems are compatible with humanoids at some point, so software compatibility at some point. And that has been something that's coming in the last 6 months almost.
Oh, okay. Excellent. Okay, that's something to keep an eye out for sure. Okay, so as we kind of round the corner here towards wrapping up. Oh, Ellie, another question. Go ahead.
Yes, going back to safety and what we just were discussing there. This one says, I'm more concerned about people on the floor using or interacting with the system. How big of a factor is that to the long-term success of the system?
Is that a mobile robot or is it for humanoids? Perhaps we can do both.
Yes, I believe both.
So, I mean, for mobile robots, they're already quite clear how to use a mobile robot safely and so on as well. There's increasing safety standards being developed. So I think that's a fairly clear process, how to interact with robots, mobile robots in a factory. When you add arms and legs to that, that is far less well defined right now. And I think it's quite hypothetical what might happen, or the how the standards or safety standards are going to be developed if the robot should just sack together, if it's a bipedal robot, or if it should stop. Or I don't think there is any consensus on that yet, or something that's come out. So that's more hypothetical things, I would say.
I'd like to spend our last few minutes here just looking towards the future and talking a little bit about some of the outlooks that we can expect to see. And I want to do this from a few different perspectives, if we can, just kind of in rapid fire approach here. So let's start on the vendor side of things. It's pretty clear from our discussion and your report that end customers are not going to be reliant on a single supplier to be able to meet all of their needs. They may want to do that, but it's not likely they're going to be able to and achieve any sort of success. So they need to be able to find the right AGV and AMR vendor for their use cases and combine those together. So let's talk first about the supplier side of that. How are you seeing vendors, suppliers adapting to this sort of multi-fleet approach that end customers are starting to take?
We're not, in a way. If you are an AGV vendor who is focused on mouse vehicles, let's say, if you don't have a big VC behind you who's paying you to develop a forklift, you're simply not going to do that. Some companies that are well funded have done that, and we have seen that companies that have a broad range of robots to kind of attack every use case there is. But we are starting to see, so one of the things I forgot to say in the beginning, at a long-term trend that we're seeing, is that we've seen in the past, we've seen a huge lack of integrators actually working on mobile robots alone and kind of integrating several different vendors, what we're talking about here now. What we're starting to see right now is that there are smaller kind of integrators popping up, starting to help with smaller deployments and how to scale those deployments, helping companies to understand how they can scale existing deployments and so on as well. So we're starting to see this integrator layer within this particular sector emerging, which is very, very interesting.
Yeah, I think that's interesting as well, and I think it's absolutely critical. I mean, the system integrator has been kind of the way that these things get introduced out into the market for decades, depending on what systems you're talking about. And this space is no different. You're going to need integrators in order to be able to successfully deploy these solutions into the end customer space. And I think there's probably other things that these OEM vendors are thinking about, even if they only have funding to develop one type of vehicle, by adhering to some of these standards like VDA 5050 we talked about, and developing more agnostic fleet management capabilities, they can position themselves to play well with others. And I think that's really the sort of the phrase of the day here is we've got to all learn how to be able to play together, because there will be a lot of us that have to be involved in these projects, and every project is going to be somewhat different. So the more that you can adhere to standards, I think the better. And obviously, yeah, this concept of this agnostic system integrator that can take multiple OEM offerings and multiple software offerings and tools, agnostic tools, and piece them together into a holistic solution. Well, that's probably what the path forward looks like, it feels like to me. And it sounds like that's bearing out in your reports as well.
Yes, I totally agree. We're seeing this, and that's why we think there will be some, perhaps not consolidation in the sector, but increasing focus on partnerships as well between companies with different strengths. So some might have a really strong forklift solution, others might have a really strong tugger solution or a mouse solution as well.
Excellent. We are getting close here, Ellie. And do you have another question or time to wrap?
Nope, just gonna go ahead and wrap us up. Anything else you want to add in there, Bryce or Tom?
I'm good.
Nope.
Thank
All
you, Tom,
right.
so much for
Yeah,
joining us today.
thank you both, and thank you everyone for joining us today. I hope you have a clearer picture about what you can expect from the AGV and AMR industry moving forward. If we didn't get a chance to answer your question, we'll make sure someone follows up with you about that. And also, if you have any other questions, or if you're struggling with a particular AGV or AMR challenge and you want to reach out to us, our experts would be happy to talk through the question with you, and also happy to show you how our intralogistics platform Lift can help out with integrating and orchestrating AGVs and AMRs. So if you want to do that, you can reach out to me directly at ellie.allenbathe@flexware.com, or you can respond to that email I'll be sending you shortly with today's recording. And then one other quick reminder, we have a webinar coming up on April 29th, and that's going to be about AGV and AMR deployment risks and how to mitigate those. So if you want to head over to that or come to that, you can head over to flexwareinnovation.com/events, get all signed up there. But again, thank you for joining us today, and I hope you have a great rest of your day. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.